On to a really positive development. Yes, there is positive news out there. And that's the Supreme Court's decision about your right to worship. You know, that little thing called the First Amendment that we used to value so much here. And it's hanging by a thread, thanks to the Supreme Court at this hour. We bring in Mike DeGrandis, who is he's with the New Civil Liberties Alliance. He represents plaintiffs, including several businesses and church pastors, in a lawsuit in Massachusetts that's very similar, I think, although maybe he'll tell us why it's different, if it's different, to what we saw before the Supreme Court against Cuomo in New York. Mike, I'm really glad you made time for us today. Hi.
Hi. Thanks for having me on.
Did I get your last name correct? Is it DeGrandis?
It's DeGrandis. You got it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for your time. Is your case similar to what we saw, the ruling against New York? And if so, was that helpful to you?
Well, it is a little helpful to us because there are some similarities, and I think a lot of states share the similarity of having governors overreach with their executive authority in making law through executive decrees, executive orders, and so forth. So in that sense, it is similar, and it impacts our case because the Supreme Court clearly spoke on issues of standards of review, of First Amendment violations of First Amendment rights, and also clearly stated that even in a pandemic, the Constitution can't be put away or forgotten. And as obvious as that may sound, it hasn't really been obvious over the last 9 months that is in fact true. And it's good for our case that the Supreme Court spoke decisively on that issue.
What are we debating at this hour still, or what is still in question legally? It seems so straightforward. If you want to have a church service, you can't tell people how to do it, and you can't tell them whether they can. I'm to a point with discussions that maybe I'm a simple guy, and I'm trying to oversimplify everything, but sometimes I think we need some simplicity and clarity, and I feel like the First Amendment's pretty straightforward and clear. Yet, I still hear people tying themselves in knots. Well, yeah, but if, and percentages, and there's a caveat, and I'm not sure that there are caveats, are there, Mike?
Well, I agree with you, and I disagree with the current constitutional jurisprudence that divides civil liberties up into fundamental rights and rights that are apparently not as fundamental. I don't think that's correct. I don't think the founders ever intended for that designation to be made. But that is how the Supreme Court views things. And what Governor Cuomo did was he stepped so far beyond the line. There were hard numerical numbers. If you were in a red or orange zone, that obviously based upon the level of pandemic spread in the particular community in New York, red or orange, you got either 10 or 25 people who could worship at your church, at your synagogue, and it had no bearing whatsoever on the size of the facility itself, the size of the place of worship. And there are some 400-person synagogues out there, 1,000-person churches, and you're talking about 10 to 25 people being allowed in there. So, the Supreme Court did say in its decision that that numerical limits may be allowed to protect the public health, but they've got to be based upon some sort of reasonable standard that you will also apply to secular businesses. Justice Gorsuch, in his concurrence, was quite clear about that issue, saying that it was a funny coincidence how it seems that pandemic safety is somehow linked to whether you're a secular business versus whether you're a church, and spread in churches versus spread in secular business, when there's absolutely no scientific evidence to support that.
It's a strange thing because, as I said off the top, I was literally on a church Zoom call as they were talking about reopening yesterday, my church. And there are things that, within the United Methodist Church, in my case, they have to defer to kind of the larger body, the conference, and it's not that they can just kind of break out and make their own autonomous decision quite as easily. But having said that, there are things that each church has to consider. Our church, for instance, runs a private daycare. Well, I mean, daycares, little kids, the government by and large has said little kids ought to be back in school, and they're not at any real risk. So there's that facet, and then there's percentages in the county, and gathering rules from the county, and then there's the element of the business of the church. So it's like, you're talking about worship, you're talking about a private business, you're talking about, multiple facets going on inside a church. And I mean, mine's not in terms of some big churches out there. Ours isn't that big, but these are real, serious discussions that are going on inside houses of worship. It's not simply about gathering on Sunday to sing and hear a sermon. I mean, there's real stuff churches are trying to consider, and I appreciate that.
Right, and churches have a lot more information now than they did back in certainly February, March, April, May. In May 2020, one of the things that makes this particular case against Governor Cuomo interesting is that the Supreme Court expressly decided that it's South Bay United Pentecostal case, in which the Supreme Court back in May said, we're not going to get in the way of Governor Newsom in California, Governor Newsom's orders restricting attendance at church. This is a scary disease. We don't know a lot about it. I think the executive has the most information. And here the Supreme Court is now saying these 7 months later, saying, no. Courts may not shelter in place when the Constitution is under attack. And that's exactly what Justice Gorsuch said in his concurrence. And I'll double down on that and suggest that free people don't socially distance themselves from their civil liberties during a pandemic. There is a certain balance here. It is important to get information about the dangers that whether it's worship or going to school or patronizing a business, people need that information. But we're a good 10 months in, and I think people have got a lot more information now that they need to protect themselves.
Yes.
And I'm just not convinced that governor's executive orders are really helping people stay safe when it's also having a serious detrimental impact on so many other aspects of life that are as important as being healthy.
Mike DeGrandis with us from the New Civil Liberties Alliance. You say something very important, and it's the frustration that, for instance, people have in Pennsylvania with Tom Wolf. The emergency orders to just continue ad infinitum to do whatever they wish, make these kind of arbitrary, we're stopping alcohol sales at 5 p.m. on Wednesday. It's based on what exactly? When does it end? And I think that's the court now finally starting to rise up, at least on the First Amendment, but I should think it would apply more broadly eventually. These emergency orders, this sort of, we don't know about the virus and we've got to do things to contain the virus. Well, we do know a lot more about the virus, to your point. And as we get more sophisticated in an emergency that's ongoing, there should be more malleability. And as you say, the Constitution doesn't extinguish itself. And we don't have these permanent executive emergency orders in place for them to do whatever they wish indefinitely. I mean, at some point, they've got to end.
Yeah, that's 100% right. And that's one of the points I tried to make in our case in Massachusetts, Desrosiers versus Baker, is that what is the limiting principle that the governor is offering the court? And quite frankly, Governor Baker offered the court no limiting principle. He's using a Civil Defense Act to declare a civil defense state of emergency to keep Massachusetts healthy from a pandemic, when Massachusetts already has a public health act that has been protecting Massachusetts from pandemics for over 100 years now. The Civil Defense Act is what it sounds like it is to protect the people of Massachusetts from invasion, armed insurrection, and also cataclysmic environmental events like fires, floods, earthquakes. If any natural cause out there can trigger a civil defense state of emergency, then there's absolutely no limit to the governor's authority. And this has happened in many states, not just in Massachusetts. And indeed, the Supreme Judicial Court had asked a number of questions about Governor Wolf and what's going on in Pennsylvania and how the Pennsylvania Supreme Court is handling these issues. Because the dynamics are different from state to state, and that's a wonderful component of our federalist system. I think that's spectacular. But a lot of these courts don't want to move on their own and start to declare their own governor's executive orders unconstitutional. But we're starting to see the dominoes fall. We've seen it in Michigan. There was a federal case in Pennsylvania, in fact, that struck down, questioned Governor Wolf's orders.
Yes.
And I'm optimistic about what might happen in Massachusetts as well.
I mean, in my lifetime anyway, I can't speak for everyone that's alive right now, but in my lifetime, we've never had something where people say for months upon months upon months with no indefinite end, I have emergency control to do what I want. I think we all understand tornadoes, Hurricane Sandy's, massive wildfires. We understand these things, but we all understand that they have a shelf life. We you know, even 9/11, for God's sakes. I mean, we were, you know, 3,000 Americans were slaughtered. You know, buildings collapsed. Utter chaos and scary despair. We were all there, and we all remember what that felt like. But it had an end, and we went back to work, and things went back to normal. This doesn't seem to allow us up off the mat ever. Some of these governors.
No, it really doesn't. And I think you raise a really good point here, too. When you've got a wildfire, in fact, before our chat here now, I think the news segment mentioned out in California there are some evacuation orders. That's a state of emergency. That we know when it starts, we know when it ends, and that's suspending the law. So if a nor'easter was to come through Philadelphia tomorrow, Governor Wolf could say, okay, state of emergency. All businesses are closed. All churches are closed. Nobody will be going to school. Nobody's going to be patronizing any business. Stay at home until the storm is over. I'll let you know when it's safe to go out again. That makes sense. It doesn't make sense to apply that type of a strategy to deal with a pandemic, because then you're no longer suspending the law temporarily for an emergency. You're dispensing with the law. And that's exactly what Governor Baker is doing in Massachusetts when he picks and chooses whose business is essential, whose is non-essential, where Governor Cuomo went way beyond and decided that while perhaps there'll be some capacity limitations in some businesses, there aren't capacity limitations in some of these essential businesses, and I'm going to put hard numerical limitations on places of worship. This is dispensing with the law, and that would be unconstitutional for a legislature to do that. And to have governors violate separation of powers this way, I'm hoping the tide is beginning to turn, because that's a scary trend.
That was my closing question for you, Mike DeGrandis, is do you think that with this ruling, essentially I think it's read as a ruling against Cuomo and his powers to curtail worship, do you think that this is a sign of more to come? Do you anticipate the Supreme Court will weigh in more on pandemic-related governance like this, or is this a one-off, or where do you think we're headed?
I think these cases are starting to mature now. I mean, it takes a little time for justice to sort of catch up with the times, and I think you're going to see more cases go to the Supreme Court. You certainly have problems where if a state Supreme Court says that your governor can make law through executive decree without limitations.
Yeah, like and I'm sorry to interrupt you here, Mike, but I mean, like ours, forget it. I mean, we got we got 5 left-wing wackos on our Supreme Court and a left-wing wacko governor, and together they're a kick line. They're happy as hell. I mean, they're pigs in slop. They're not going to check our governor at all. So if not the United States Supreme Court, then we're just stuck. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead, please.
Right. Oh, no. I think it's an important point. I think the question that people in Pennsylvania need to ask themselves is, do we have a Republican form of government anymore? Article 4, Section 4 of the United States Constitution guarantees to us that our state governments will be Republican in form. It's no longer a Republican form of government if I've got a chief executive, a governor, just making law by decree. That is not how the process works. It makes the process very difficult to change as well, as we're seeing across the country. That's why you need legislatures to debate these issues with those are your representatives who are closer to your communities, who understand your community's unique needs. You have access to these people. You don't have access to your governor. It's just a function of the office. It's just one person. And only insiders can influence a governor, whereas each and every single one of us can influence our state legislators.
Mike DeGrandis with the New Civil Liberties Alliance. We'll stay in touch. Thanks for your work, sir.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.